in debt to China. Let's bring in retired Lieutenant General Keith Kellogg, former National Security Advisor to Vice President Mike Pence, and a Fox News contributor. Let's quickly get you to talk about what Milley was talking about here and the threat from China. He's suggesting that in 5 years from now, they're going to be bristling with so many weapons that they'll be like a porcupine. And you try to swallow that, you're going to run into a lot of problems.
Yeah, John, well, thanks for having me. Look, here's the frustration I get with the military. They're talking about it. First of all, when you look at the defense budget they've got now, they talk about China as a competitor. I said, okay, I don't buy that. I think China is not a competitor. France is a competitor. They're an adversary. And then they talk about China as a pacing challenger. And that's the language you use in the Pentagon. I have no idea what a pacing challenger is. That's a brand new term that I've never heard used. But when you look back on it, when you step back and think strategically what's going on, at the end of World War II, we said, okay, Churchill went to Fulton, Missouri, and he talked about the Iron Curtain descending upon Europe. Then you had the Truman Doctrine, which was containment of the Soviet Union. Tell me the policy we have towards China right now. We don't have one. There's no policy strategically of how we are going to handle China, either economically or militarily. And we talk a lot about it. We talk about it on Capitol Hill. You see General Milley talking about it. You see Lloyd Austin talking about it. And nobody's come up with a big solution, and they need to do that. And then they're using the same old thing about debt diplomacy, and they're being very smart about it. Look what they're let's just use an example of what they did in Djibouti. They used debt diplomacy to build a port. They couldn't fulfill the debt. They take over the port. They go to Kenya. They build a road in Kenya. What's a big port there? Mombasa. So they're actually strategically placing themselves in Africa, 54 countries, but they place themselves in a good place. And what do? We file a flight plan of going to Africa, and they've actually got a plan how to go into the continent and how to take over infrastructure, and they do that so they can enforce what they call the old Silk Road or one belt, one road.
Yeah, well, let me just go to call for number 2 here, because this is quite stunning. As you pointed out, 54 countries in Africa, 29 of them have got substantial loans from China. China goes in there and say, you want a 5G system? Great, we'll build it for you for pennies on the dollar. When, as you pointed out, when they can't pay back the loan, they say, okay, well, we'll own the system. And then all of that intel gets funneled back to China. We're going to build you a port for pennies on the dollar. You can't pay for it? Okay, great, we'll take over the port. How far behind the curve in Africa, as Kamala Harris is there visiting 3 countries in Africa, how far behind the curve is the United States there?
Well, we're not even on the curve. We just visit when we think it's a good idea to visit there. They've actually got a strategy, and that strategy with One Belt, One Road, of how to use it and build infrastructure and then take over the ports out there. We just happen to show up and say, okay, we're here. It's really nice that we're here, but we don't bring anything to the table, much like they are.
So the U.S. is promising $55 billion in financial aid investment in Africa. I think Kamala Harris went over there with a check for $130 million or so. But take a look at what China's doing. Call for number 3 here. Trade between China and Africa is now at $200 billion a year. 10,000 Chinese companies are doing business in Africa. And the total value of Chinese business in Africa is more than $2 trillion. How do we compete with that now? I mean, you got Kamala Harris going to 3 countries. I think Obama went there 4 times. George Bush went to 6 countries. Bill Clinton went to 6 countries. This administration is like, okay, we'll go to 3 countries. Maybe Biden will go. We don't know.
But you have to have a plan to do it. Look, I'll do an intellectual leap. Look what's happening in this hemisphere. Just the other day, Honduras just said we're going to recognize China instead of Taiwan. Well, that's because the Chinese made inroads here into Latin America and South America as well. Forget the old Monroe Doctrine. They're just all over, and they've got a plan to do it. That's the reason I keep going back to what's our plan. We had a plan against Russia and the Soviet Union, and that was the Truman Doctrine. What's our plan for handling China? And there isn't one. We actually saw that in the last administration. It took us about 2 years. But then we said, we got a real problem here. COVID took over. And then we all turned really hard about, okay, we've got to figure this thing out about China.
Global influence quickly leads to global dominance.
It does.
That's what the Chinese are all about. All right. Keith, great to see you.
Thanks, John.
Thank you.